This little manuscript here is called Hayklans Luck, and it's by Elizabeth Cochrane. Chapter 10, London. London, thou art of towns, our per se mighty carbuncle of virtue and valour. I was working in my studio at our Finchley house when Mr. and Mrs. Hayklan came to view it. They had with them 2 young people, their eldest son and daughter. I paid little attention to them as I was very busy drafting out an advertisement for Clark's shoes. After a while, the young man and his sister came back to the studio. "Do you mind if we wait here for a while?" the young man asked. "They are always talking about carpets, curtains and chandeliers." This was true, it being the main topic of conversation in our house for weeks. Hastily removing some wet paintbrushes and 2 or 3 bottles of poster paint from the settee, I invited them to sit down. "I'm Michael," said the young man, "and this is my sister Rose." I had scarcely looked at them until this moment, but when I glanced at the young woman, I saw that she looked and was a lady, also almost the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. She had an oval face with pure white skin, which looked as if it had a light behind it. Her eyes were clear dark sea blue, with dark curly lashes. Her hair was dark and gently waved. "Sit down," I stammered, wondering if I could ask her to pose as a model. They waited politely until their parents were ready to go. "Do you think they will buy the house?" I asked my father. "Almost certainly," he said. "If I can prevent your mother from scratching the lady's eyes out." I saw his point. The 2 women were like the traditional Kilkenny cats. It seemed that my father had taken to Mr. Hayklan. In fact, it was hardly a week later that my mother complained to me that Hayklan has taken my Paul to Le Havre. I heard later from Michael that Leah had also complained that Captain has taken my Boris to Le Havre. The house sale and its complications went on for some weeks. I was working during the week at my Cock Lane studio, but on Saturday, on coming home, my father said to me, "That young Hayklan has asked my permission to take you out to the theatre one evening." My mouth fell open. It was not the custom in those days to ask permission of parents to take out young ladies. "I told him to ask you himself," said my father, washing his hands of the matter. The young man did ask me. I accepted rather reluctantly, as he was not an art student and looked much too tidy and well dressed for my taste. The evening was fixed. He drove up to the house in a magnificent straight-8 Buick in full evening dress and wearing a top hat. He had taken a box at the theatre. I was embarrassed, as I was not dressed for boxes. However, I practically forgave him, for his choice of the play was Pirandello's A Death Takes a Holiday, which I had no hope of seeing except from the gallery. After this expedition, I was asked to dine with him at Gennaro's and was presented with the usual red carnation. It was all a bit beyond one being used to Charlotte Street at the most. Presently, my father remarked to me, "Why don't you ask that young Michael to one of your studio parties? He is always taking you out." I was horrified. "He wouldn't mix in," I said. However, he was asked and mixed fairly well. In return, I was asked to tea at Michael's home. It was a most frighteningly spotless house, polish everywhere, and a row of neatly dressed children sitting quietly at the table. All had the elder sister's dark blue eyes and curly lashes. All behaved beautifully, asking me polite questions and not chatting with each other. After 1 or 2 visits, I had the temerity to ask Michael if I might borrow the Buick to drive my mother up to Harrogate, our car being somewhat uncomfortable for such a long journey. I was embarrassed when Michael referred this request to his father. I need not have worried. "Certainly you might take it," said Boris. In fact, you might keep it as far as I am concerned. The thing is nothing but a death ride going to the city. I have to ask Michael to pull up at a bus stop, as it is too dangerous to proceed further in such a vehicle. Having had some experience of Michael's driving, I understood. It was the most wonderful car I had ever driven, so powerful that no way could one let it full out, even on the North Road. My mother was very pleased with it and became somewhat reconciled to the way she considered Leah had beaten her down over carpets, curtains and chandeliers. Boris and Paul continued to have sly weekends at Le Havre, where Paul had many friends, as he was based there during the war. It is something that came to my attention after my grandmother had died. That in actual fact he did have another family, another lady and another daughter in Le Havre, but my grandmother never knew that. In fact, that bit of information came to me from my great aunt, who was a friend of her family's, but she was actually on my mother's side, so both families gossiping about each other. But yes, so he had more than just friends in Le Havre. Meanwhile, Boris's workshop was flourishing and gained a well-deserved reputation for good work in the city. After a while, Michael began to pester me to marry him. I was a little taken aback, as I had no intention of marrying anyone, marrying being too expensive and complicated to bother with when you were fully employed doing advertisements and joke drawings. All my friends thought so as well, so that I had received no other serious offers and was quite surprised at this one. I put Michael off as politely as I could. Much time passed and the 1929 depression crept slowly upon us. At this point, I'm just going to add an anecdote that my grandmother told me herself. She said that there were only two young men that used to turn up to these parties and stay behind afterwards and do all the washing up. And one of them was Michael. So her friends actually did turn around to her and say to her, "You've got to marry one of these guys because they're fantastic at doing all the cleaning up after the parties." Just a little side note. The depression is coming. Boris, ever kind-hearted, took it into his employ any out-of-work person who applied to him. Therefore, the workshop was festooned with derelicts, Lascar seamen and latterly Jarrow marchers, all leaned on brooms and not knowing what to do. Leah swept in occasionally and said to Rose, who was controlling the office, "Give them all their cards, give them Christmas cards, then get rid of them." On Saturday, Rose gave them their cards, but whispered to them to come back on Monday just the same. So the luxury trades in London became bankrupt one by one, until Carey Street had 6 years of cases lined up and was unable to cope with them. Sadly, Boris's firm came under the hammer also. I had eventually married Michael, having told him that I would do so if we could live in the Regent's Park Road. He produced the lease of a very nice flat there in the space of a fortnight, so I could not refuse. With Hayklans Luck, I had just signed a contract with the Daily Sketch for the Impossible People cartoons, thus saving ourselves from starvation. These little cartoons were like little one column little pieces that went in every single day. And they were so popular at the time that eventually they actually made a book, and I will show you that. I will put a picture of that in here. But they were terribly, terribly popular, and I think she did very well with them. She also did cartoons in the Sunday supplements, but that will come a little bit later. No one within Leah's reach was allowed to be idle. She went out shopping. She gave her orders. "Rosella, you will vacuum the carpets. Sarella, you will clean the windows. Annabella, you will polish the fireplace." Then turning to me, she was a little nonplussed, not knowing my capability for house cleaning. "Sherry," she commanded, "you will make some of your nice Yorkshire parkin." When Michael and I were established in our flat, she visited us and looked around contemptuously. "I cannot afford an expensive present," she said, "but I will give you Slater." Slater was an ex-jockey who had been disabled by a fall from a horse and had been rescued from poverty, there being no DHSS in those days, by Boris. He was taken into their home and washed, paint and cleaned shoes until further orders, and there were very many. I was aghast. "You can't give people away like that," I said. "Besides, where would he sleep?" "There's a good room behind the kitchen," said Lee. It has a window." "But that's the coal hole," I objected. There was indeed a large space under the front steps of the house where in days gone by 10 tons of coal were shot in through a small aperture in the side wall. I did not give the matter another thought until a week later, when a small figure pushing a handcart came to the house. It was Slater, with a bed, a carpet and all his belongings. "Madam says I've to work for you," he announced. "But you can't," I said. "There is nowhere for you to sleep. Ma'am says there's a good room back of the kitchen, behind that copper." He unpacked and installed himself. He was certainly a good wedding present. He had worked for Leah for 10 years and knew his job. Soon our flat looked like fairly presentable and smelt of furniture polish. When my first son was born, he firmly insisted on feeding by the clock and not picking him up now. "I've had experience," he said, "with Madam's lot. Once when the child was crying, a neighbour complained. 'That baby has been crying for 20 minutes. "Yes," said Slater, looking at his watch, "and he's going to cry 10 minutes more, and it ain't his feeding time yet." Almost the first words my son uttered were, "Oh God!" "Slater," I asked, "what have you been saying to this child?" "Just what he said," he replied. "Owls for Gigi's, dog for Bow Wow. Oh my God, what else do you want?" Meanwhile, Boris was manfully fighting the depression. His elder sons were told to drive to faraway places like Doncaster and Devizes in order to reach a different market. Unfortunately, many of these places had racetracks, and often enough, most of the profit obtained by these expeditions was lost before they returned to London. Chapter 11. Bankruptcies, Blitzes and Barnstable. It could not last. The devil roaring ho, let Hitler be restored the status quo. In spite of all his efforts, Boris's firm went into bankruptcy with all the rest. Leah at once sold the house at Finchley and installed her family in a more modest establishment. With the money this saved, Boris started a small workshop once more in the city. His reputation was still thought well of. His factory had been called the Board of Guardians in the Depression, and many people contacted him again. It was not long before he was building up a very good business again. Rose ran the office, Sally the workshop, and Anne stayed at home polishing the furniture. Also the front steps. She polished them so well that the postman fell over and broke his leg. Things were going quite well for all. Boris able to establish himself again as a leading furrier, and was even able to teach Michael one end of a fur knife from the other. I was now doing the children's page of the Daily Sketch and had 2 sons and 4 daughters. We moved to Thorpe Bay to live near my parents, and Boris and Leah were able to buy a very nice house at Muswell Hill. Unfortunately, it could not last. After bailiffs, bankruptcies and babies came the bombs. The war came, and with it the almost complete destruction of the City of London. Boris still ran his workshop making fur jackets for the army. He and his head cutter became wardens and spent many nights on the roof of their building in tin hats with buckets and shovels looking out for incendiary bombs. One night it became impossible for them to stay up there, as so many heavy explosives were coming down, so they went downstairs to the entrance hall and had to stay there as it was too dangerous to venture out. Buildings were being demolished all around, leaving only the iron girders. The furniture and the materials of the workshop were blazing in the basement. Fire hoses were everywhere. After a while, the head cutter fell on his knees and begged God to forgive him his sins. Boris hauled him up by his collar and said, "Stand up and meet it like a man." It seems strange that a similar remark was made by my mother's father during a terrible storm on the Yorkshire moors. He and the head keeper were sheltering on a lambing, but the keeper fell on his knees also, and my grandfather dragged him to his feet, making the same remark as Boris, "Meet it like a man." Next day there was no more workshop or any sign of what it had been, except one of the work girls standing outside sobbing. A policeman asked her if she had lost a relative. "No," she replied, "I've lost the workshop," which shows with what affection Boris was held by his workers. Boris and Leah still had young children, although the elder boys were in the army. Both Muswell Hill and Thorpe Bay became unsuitable places to bring up children, so Boris decided to move to Devon. Rose had been driving an ambulance and spent her time picking up corpses. Her Auntie Katie said she caused more damage than the bombs, but this was not true. She had to give it up on Leah's orders, as every time she went to the mortuary, the man in charge burst into tears and said, "No more, I've got nothing to cover them with, and it's not decent." Rose stole all the sheets and tablecloths she could lay her hands on from home, but it was not enough, and it upset Leah. Sonny was at Dunkirk and Sammy a gunner at the Suffolk airfield. Michael, having been born in Paris, tried to join the Free French Army. They would have none of him when they found out he was married with children. They said, "Zut alors, vous êtes tout de suite." Boris found a very good house called High Wall over the river from Barnstaple. Michael and I had a terrible farm house in Somerset, but were commanded to join Boris as he very bravely set up his workshop in the town. Chapter 12. Devon. Boris and Leah were able to sell their Muswell Hill property and take themselves and younger children to the comparative safety of Devon. They bought a house called High Wall on the other side of the river from Barnstaple, in which town Boris soon set up his workshop and maintained his work for the army, adding to it the fortunate circumstances that because of clothing coupons, every woman wished to have her fur coat reformed or altered. Rose left the ambulance driving and ran the office, while Sally was, as usual, ran the factory. Anne remained in the WAF, who evidently found her service indispensable. Nonconformist as ever, on her first route march in the service, she fell out of line and waited at a bus stop, went back to the barracks, where she demanded to the CO, "I came into the army to do catering," she explained, "not to go for country walks." The officer was so astounded that he was immediately taken into the kitchens and proved so capable that she found it difficult to leave the service. Lee found Michael and I comfortable small house in Barnstaple and rescued us from the deplorable Rose Tree Farm. Sonny had been discharged from the army after his return from Dunkirk, where he had been badly hurt trying to hold up the entire German army in a village, and was highly commended for doing so. With Hayklans Luck and hard work, the business flourished as usual and became highly respected in the town. Sally became engaged to a young airman stationed at the airfield. Rose and Anne both married local businessmen, brothers, and set up homes for themselves. That would be the Parkhouse brothers. As the business expanded, Boris decided to have branches in local towns, Nate in Exmouth, Ray in Bristol, Sonny in Bath, and Michael and I in Exeter. The war at last came to an end. Without the everlasting air raids, fire watching and shortages, life seemed more worthwhile, and we helped via the children and all the others in Thornton Hill to celebrate with a grand outdoor picnic. Our American soldiers went home, but some came back to visit us with many thanks for our hospitality. Our happiness, however, was overshadowed by the sad news that my father-in-law Boris had been taken with a sudden heart attack on returning home one evening and did not recover. sadly missed by his family and many friends. He was a gentleman in the true sense of the word. Let us hope that he is in his Arcadian forest with his horse and dog, letting the white foxes out of the traps. Nishdenover. God bless you. And there ends Hayklans Luck.